All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're tackling a literary puzzle that's almost 2,700 years old. It's a mystery at the heart of one of the most incredible books ever written, the Book of Isaiah. And the big question is, who actually wrote this thing?
For most of history, everyone just assumed Isaiah was a single, unified masterpiece. But, for the past couple hundred years, a lot of scholars have started to argue that it's actually two or maybe even more books that were just kind of stitched together. So, which is it? One book, one author, or a collection of writings from totally different time periods?
And this right here, this lays out the whole problem. On one hand, you've got the first 39 chapters. The theme, warning and judgment. The setting, the 8th century BCE, when Assyria was the big superpower. But then, bam! You hit chapter 40 and everything changes. The tone flips completely to comfort and hope, and the setting jumps forward nearly 200 years to the Babylonian exile. It's such a jarring shift, and it's the entire reason we're even having this debate.
Okay, so let's put on our detective hats for a minute and really dig into the case for multiple authors. This is the argument that comes from a field often called higher criticism, and honestly, it presents some pretty compelling evidence.
So the whole case really boils down to three key arguments. The ideas and concepts are different, the language and style are different, and, this is the big one we're going to focus on, the historical backgrounds are worlds apart. For a lot of scholars, this last point is pretty much the smoking gun. Right, so the historical setting is really the crucial point for this whole view. The thinking goes like this. Prophets speak to the people of their own time, right? So the idea that a prophet in the 8th century BCE would be writing this super detailed message of comfort for an audience living in exile 150 years in the future, well, to them, that just doesn't seem plausible.
And this timeline just perfectly illustrates the problem. Isaiah's ministry wraps up around 681 BCE. But the second half of the book, it sounds like the exile, which didn't even start until 586 BCE, has already happened. It even names Cyrus the Great as Israel's deliverer, and he doesn't show up until 539 BCE. We're talking about a massive, massive time gap to try and explain.
This quote really just sums up that critical perspective. I mean, if you take the idea of divine, predictive prophecy off the table, the only logical conclusion you can really come to is that someone living during the Babylonian exile must have written chapters 40 through 66. It's not a prediction, it's just them describing their own world.
But hold on, that's only one side of the story. Let's flip the script and see how the defense responds, because there are some really powerful arguments for the traditional view that Isaiah is a single, unified book written by a single author.
So the first counterargument really hits that idea of relevance head-on. The critics say, hey, a message about a future rescue would be totally irrelevant to Isaiah's original audience. But is that really true? You gotta look at the context.
Think about it. After the good king Hezekiah died, his son Manasseh took over, and the whole nation just plunged into this awful period of idolatry and turning away from God. For the faithful few who were still listening to Isaiah, things looked bleak. Judgment and exile probably seemed inevitable. In a dark time like that, a message of future hope and deliverance wouldn't be irrelevant at all. It would be an absolutely vital lifeline.
Now this might be the most powerful piece of physical evidence there is. You want to know how many ancient manuscripts have ever been found that show Isaiah as two separate books? 0. Zilch, not a single one.
In fact, all the manuscript evidence we have points in the exact opposite direction. The Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the famous Dead Sea Scrolls from the 2nd century BCE, is one continuous, complete book. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation from around the same period, also presents Isaiah as a single, unified work. As far back as we can possibly trace, it was always one book.
Okay, the second major piece of evidence for unity comes from the New Testament. Its writers quote the prophet Isaiah by name 21 times, and get this, they pull quotes from both halves of the book, treating it all as the work of the very same author.
This verse from the Gospel of John is just a perfect example. Right before he says this, John quotes a passage from Isaiah chapter 53, that's from the so-called second part, and another one from Isaiah chapter 6, the first part. Then he says, clear as day, Isaiah said this, linking both quotes to the same guy. For the New Testament authors, there was just no question about it.
So if it is one book, how in the world do we explain that jarring shift in tone and setting we talked about? Well, the answer might not be about who wrote it, but about how the book was so masterfully put together. We need to look at the structure.
A lot of scholars now see chapters 36 through 39 not as some random historical appendix, but as a deliberately placed hinge that connects the two halves of the book. It's the literary bridge that skillfully walks us from the world of Assyria right into the world of Babylon. And here's the crucial part. This section is arranged for a logical reason, not a chronological one. The story about Hezekiah foolishly showing off all his treasures to the Babylonians ends with Isaiah's prophecy that everything in that palace will be carried off to Babylon. By putting that prediction right at the end of chapter 39, the author perfectly sets the stage for the message of comfort from Babylon that kicks off in chapter 40. It's an absolutely brilliant literary move.
And all of this leads to a really fascinating, kind of beautiful way to understand the book's complex structure, which was proposed by a scholar named Dr. Alan McRae. He suggests that we shouldn't read Isaiah 40 to 66 as a linear, logical argument. We should read it as a symphony. So, what on earth is a symphonic structure? Well, think of it like a piece of music. An author will weave together major themes just like melodies. A theme is introduced, then it fades out, another one comes in, and then the first one comes back, maybe even stronger. The point isn't a step-by-step logical proof. It's to create an emotional and psychological journey, designed to bring real comfort to people who are in deep misery.
And here they are, the major melodies you hear over and over again in Isaiah's second half. You've got the theme of comfort, the theme of God's incredible power, the theme of how useless idols are, the theme of God's all-knowing nature, and finally, this mysterious and incredibly important figure of the servant of the Lord. These 5 themes just swirl and intertwine all through these chapters. And that final theme, the servant of the Lord, that's arguably the climax of the entire symphony. Why? Because it doesn't just talk about the problem of exile. It goes deeper. It addresses the root cause behind the exile in the first place, the problem of human sin. It's the ultimate answer to the book's deepest question. So maybe, just maybe, the mystery of Isaiah isn't solved by chopping the book in two. Maybe the real answer is found when we appreciate the incredible literary genius behind its composition. A symphonic masterpiece designed to speak a single, unified message of both judgment and hope across the ages. So in the end, we're left with 2 different ways of looking at this book. Is it just a collection of different arguments and historical bits and pieces that some editor put together? Or is it a single, intentionally woven symphony of profound and timeless themes?
And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. What happens when we approach a complex text not just as a logical argument we need to dissect, but as a symphony we need to experience? How does that change not only what we understand, but how we're moved by it?